I've said this before and I continue to say it. There is great demand. There is more demand for managed services than there are credible, mature providers of MSP services. You've probably heard me say it. If you haven't heard me say it, now you've heard it. There's more demand for managed services providers than there are actual quality MSPs to deliver those services, which gets me to my earlier point. The number of actual MSPs out there is pretty small when you apply any type of reasonable maturity classification to those companies. What does that mean? If you were to look at the 150 to 200,000 quote MSPs that I talked about, that would include MSPs that are very early on in their maturity progression. How big is the managed services profession? I mean, we ask that question a lot. I get asked that question a lot. You may be asking that question a lot. It's understandable. People want to know more about this thing called managed services. It's been around for decades, literally. And so much now is riding on the hopes and dreams and success of the MSP community for a variety of reasons. Our national critical infrastructure all over the world, MSPs literally make global commerce happen. No joke. That's an understatement, if anything. And yet, some of you may be really shocked to learn how big the market actually is. And I don't mean about revenue. I mean about the actual number of MSPs doing the work. And that's what I'm going to talk about today is looking at the actual size of the MSP community relative to how much revenue that community produces in the global economy. And that is going to be a very eye-opening endeavor because I think a lot of people have a very skewed, very, perhaps altered version or viewpoint of what our industry looks like and what we're going through and the growth we're seeing. And they look at it from a revenue standpoint, not necessarily from a number of MSP standpoint. So buckle up. You're going to not want to miss this. Before we get into how big the market is from a number of MSP standpoint, it's helpful to understand the economics and the reporting of MSP economics because for such a large community, we have some of the worst economic financial modeling and reporting that exists. I mean, compared to, let's say, medical, compared to legal, compared to even engineering and accounting, I mean, there are so many other industries that do a far better job of getting to the numbers behind their profession. And the MSP space that's been kind of the one area that I personally feel like we could do a much better job at. Now, there's some good analyst firms, not a lot, but there's some good analyst firms who are doing decent work that covers managed services. I don't want to knock anybody by name or leave anybody off of a list, but I'll just say that we do need, as a general rule, to be doing a lot better when it comes to monitoring and reporting on and tracking data, specifically financial data related to the managed services market. And some of what I'm going to talk about explains why we have that kind of gap. But in order to understand and make sense of the actual number of MSPs that are out there, it's really helpful to understand what the financial picture looks like and then plug in the number of MSPs into that equation. And that'll make, I hope, a lot more sense. So I just literally before we started hitting record here, I went into my favorite artificial intelligence program and typed in size of the global IT services market. And then I typed in after that, compare it to the global managed services IT market. And this is the information that I got. So I'm literally reading right hot off the press. Now, these are 2024 numbers, our last full calendar year that we have data on. Obviously, I think this has changed since then, now that we're beyond midway past 2025. But said that the global IT services market was around 1.5 trillion, 1.5 trillion in 2024. And that is a huge number. I'm almost positive is coming from Gartner. That sounds like a Gartner number to me. So 1.5 trillion, which, if you've been watching them over the last 10, 15 years, this is a fairly predictable number. You can see that number trending over the years. And I would have a fair amount of faith in Gartner's ability to accurately peg global IT services. Now, global IT services means a lot of different things to a lot of different people. Again, one of the problems is defining what things mean has been a challenge in managed services for a long time. But if you take a look at global IT services, which is kind of, I look at it as it's the kitchen sink for IT services. It's everything. It's project, it's managed services, absolutely. It's cloud services. It strips out, I'm almost positive in that number, strips out things like hardware and software, but it's project, non-project, managed services types of revenue being accounted for in that $1.5 trillion. Now, the next number is kind of more important, right? Because I asked the AI system to come up with a number of comparing global IT services to managed services, and this is what it came up with as of 2024. Now, remember, the number was 441 billion in managed IT services. I think that that's low. I think that number is today in 2025. It's almost certainly much bigger. I would say it's probably over 500 billion, to be sure. But even as of 2024, I would have thought that it would have been a much higher number. But anyway, they call it 441 billion. Let's just give them the benefit of the doubt, and let's just call it managed services in 2024 was globally producing around just shy of $500 billion in revenue. Let's look at the growth rate, right? If you accept these numbers, right, $1.5 trillion in global IT services spending, let's just round up and just call it $500 billion, 500 billion in managed services globally. It's a fraction of the total pie, but it's growing remarkably fast. And that's my first data point that I want you to pay attention to. The growth rate of managed services in the larger pie of IT services is going quickly. Global IT services growth rates are, as of last year, somewhere around 7%, maybe upwards of 9%. Managed services growth rates are closer to 11 to 14%. So managed services is, as a growth, the rate of growth is much bigger, much faster, more rapid than general IT services. Both are growing. One is growing faster than the other. And I think managed services if you track that number, I don't have that data with me, but I'll try to come up with it in a future episode. But I am almost positive that if you plotted a line of managed services growth compared to IT services growth, that the managed services trend line is and has been for probably a decade or more. Maybe some off years, maybe 2009, 2010 might have been an off year. Maybe. I don't know that for sure, but I think overall, managed services has been outpacing growth in terms of IT services for quite some time. Don't forget that. That's a big indicator of which horse you want to be betting on, right? Managed services, as much as people knock managed services, at least in the IT channel, it's growing remarkably fast. And that's because it's so valuable. So now we know that. Now we know the size of managed services, at least in terms of revenue being produced. And again, I think that if there's any type of flexibility or some vagueness built into any of these numbers, it's probably managed services. I think that the managed services number is probably much higher. And I think that it's probably much higher because people don't understand and don't have a very consistent definition of managed services to apply. That's a huge problem of why we have all of these wild numbers out there, right? Of how big is the market? Well, I think it's this. Someone says, I think it's that. Well, how can both be true? They can't be, but you produce wildly inconsistent outcomes when you have a lack of a definition to apply to nail things down, which is what I want to talk about next. The size of the market is undeniably big. The growth rate of the managed services market is undeniably strong and continuing to be strong. I don't want to go into the reasons why. You all know the reasons why. It's cybersecurity, it's cloud adoption, it's now AI adoption. I think that whatever the pace of cloud adoption for the last 10 years has been in terms of a fuel agent for managed services growth, I think that AI is going to make that. I think AI, we are at the very, very beginning of infrastructure and energy build out just to keep up with and fuel the demand for AI over the next 5 or 10 years. I think that that is going to bring a tremendous amount of opportunity for managed service providers. We'll talk about that almost guaranteed in future episodes. But for now, it's one of several major driving agents and causes of growth in the managed services profession. But if I told you, right, if we stop the tape right here, stop the discussion, and you said, well, great, managed services is producing about half a $500 billion every year. That's good. Is that the end of the picture? Is that the end of the analysis? I would say no. Because a lot of the conversations I have of companies that come to us and say, hey, Charles, we want help in building an MSP channel program. How do we do it? What's the total addressable market size? And they want to know what the financial upside is. But eventually they ask the question, well, how many MSP entities are there really out there? And that produces a lot less of a predictable response, because we have a database. There are probably 3 or 4 other private companies out there who have databases of MSPs themselves, and we can do some analysis along the following lines. If you have, let's say, 4 companies, 4 entities, including MSP Alliance, who have a database of, let's say, 30,000 companies or more, there's going to be some overlap, right? So if you compile all those databases together, that would be 4 companies with roughly 30,000 MSP companies in each database. That would be what, at least 100,000 MSP organizations, right? By the numbers, right? 4 times 25,000, get 100,000. There's some overlap. How much overlap? That's a matter of speculation. Is it a 1-to-1 overlap? No. They're not exact duplicates of each other by any means, right? You have different ecosystems, right? You have the ConnectWise ecosystem, you have the kind of the Kaseya, and now the Datto, now that they've acquired Datto. So you have the Kaseya ecosystem, you've got the Enable ecosystem. So those are 3 ecosystems right there alone that have probably at least 25,000 MSPs in their ecosystem. And then MSP Alliance, we have about 30,000 plus in our ecosystem. And we haven't even gotten to the other communities, ecosystems that exist out there. You have distributors, like you have Ingram Micro, you now have Pax8, you've got TD Synnex, you've got a handful, and these are just kind of North American dominant, right? We haven't even begun to talk about Latin America or APAC or Europe and so on. If you added all of those databases up, you would end up with a probably something in the magnitude of 150 to 200,000 service providers, MSPs, right? Some might call it MSPs. I would call them service providers, and that's being very generous. Are they all MSPs? Absolutely not. There is no way in hell that I would classify all of those databases, including maybe, a handful even in ours, as crazy as that would sound like. Would all of those companies be classified properly as MSPs? No. They would be so far down they would be so early on in their maturity progression in managed services that I don't think that they would be credibly classified as a managed IT service provider. That doesn't mean that they're not good. It doesn't mean that they're not legitimate. It doesn't mean that they're not contributing in some way to that $500 billion in spend that we talked about earlier. It just means that I and others probably wouldn't classify them properly as an MSP. That's the problem that I talked about earlier that we have, is how do you classify the number of MSPs, right? Which if you can't even do that, then how are you going to accurately peg and produce a number of how much revenue they produce, right? That's a real issue. We have no official body that says you are capable of calling yourself an MSP, right? If you're in the United States of America and you want to call yourself, if you want to be a doctor, right? You have to be licensed by somebody at a state level. Therefore, the revenue that you produce as a doctor, as a licensed physician, is going to be a heck of a lot more accurate because they have a very crystal clear idea of who is and is not a doctor, right? I don't have a medical degree. I'm not an MD. Therefore, I cannot be part of that revenue count that goes towards physician or medical revenue, right? Make sense? Hopefully. Same thing with lawyers, same things with CPAs, certified public accountants or chartered accountants in Canada, right? You have their professional bodies that license and restrict access in order to be part of that professional community. The managed services community has no such construct. Now, the MSP Alliance exists and has existed for 25 years, and we have created code of ethics for MSPs. We have a customer bill of rights for consumers of managed services, and we have a control-based framework for determining certification as a MSP organization that we've all produced as a community for the last 25 years. So it's not like we haven't been sitting idle and just doing nothing. We've actually produced a ton of work and accomplished quite a bit. The issue is that we have made a collective decision. And MSP Alliance, I know this for a fact because I've been part of these conversations that we have said as a community, we are not going to isolate and keep out companies that want to be members of the MSP Alliance and want to become members of the global MSP community. I've said this before and I continue to say it. There is great demand. There is more demand for managed services than there are credible, mature providers of MSP services. You've probably heard me say it. If you haven't heard me say it, now you've heard it. There's more demand for managed services providers than there are actual quality MSPs to deliver those services, which gets me to my earlier point. The number of actual MSPs out there is pretty small when you apply any type of reasonable maturity classification to those companies. What does that mean? If you were to look at the 150 to 200,000 quote MSPs that I talked about, that would include MSPs that are very early on in their maturity progression. That would include MSPs that are somewhere in the middle, and that would include MSPs that are quite proficient and have been doing this for some time, or at least can demonstrate proficiency regardless of how long they've been in business. It would include all of those segments and plots in between, but there is no cutoff marker. There's no licensing marker that exists where it says, before this line, you're not an MSP, and after that line, you are an MSP. Now we have MSP Verify. The MSP Verify report is a report that has been in existence for 15 plus years. And there are certainly those that say, well, that is a good indicator of who a real MSP is because they've been tested, they've been certified, and they go through third-party review, which is a heck of a lot more than what the 98% of the rest of the market has done. I think that there's a fair argument for that. Does it mean that the other MSPs aren't valid? No, it doesn't mean that. Does it mean that those other MSPs are not contributing to the $500 billion in managed services revenue in 2024? No, it doesn't mean that at all. But there's a growing divide between the mature certified MSPs and the work that they are doing is beginning now to become so distinctly different than the rest of the MSPs that it's in the very near future, there is going to be a kind of a have and a have not scenario where the MSPs that are competent, matured, and certified. I mean, the certification is just evidence that they are doing the things that they're supposed to be doing. It doesn't mean that there aren't MSPs that are matured. But if you're a mature MSP and you can't prove it, that's as good as not being a mature MSP at all. Because if you can't demonstrate your maturity, if you can't demonstrate all the things that make a good MSP, what do you have, right? That's like a surgeon saying, well, I'm a really good surgeon. I never went to medical school, but I'm a really, really good surgeon, right? Nobody today would say, yeah, that's the person I want to operate on me. You want to see proof. You want to see evidence. Now, that profession has a plaque on the wall. The MSP doesn't have that plaque on the wall. They have the MSP Verify. That's the best thing so far, the best thing in 30 years that we have as MSPs to be able to demonstrate compliance, to be able to demonstrate maturity, to be able to demonstrate competency as a managed service provider. It doesn't mean that they're perfect. It doesn't mean that they're the best MSP on the planet, above all else. It just means that they are a competent MSP demonstrated in doing the fundamental best practices that we value in this profession. And that number, right, is far less than the 200,000 that I referenced earlier. That number of companies that are either certified or capable of being certified is probably, honestly, in the 5,000 range, 5 to 10,000 range, maybe. That's not a lot of MSPs, right? That's not enough MSPs at all. Now, if you're shocked to hear that number and you're saying, Charles, how could 5,000, how could 10,000 MSPs produce anything close to half a $500 billion in managed services spend? No, that's not what I'm saying. What I'm saying is if you took that whole number, the 500 trillion being produced by probably close to 150 to 200,000 providers, if you really applied a consistent general standard of practice to those 200,000, I would say more than half would fail. More than half would fail utterly. They wouldn't have any general understanding or ability to demonstrate that they are doing things internally that they should be doing. I'm talking about backing up their own data, using MFA consistently. I'm talking about having good, solid change management process. I would be talking about having good contracts, having good invoices that match up to contracts that can be audited from start to finish, including service change requests. I'm talking about running fundamental, necessary security solutions internally to their practice, like EDR, MDR, SIM tools, things of that nature. And I'm just hitting the basics, right? There's a lot more that I could talk about, but you may be like scratching your heads out there watching and listening to this and saying, well, is that really true? Could we literally have half of 200,000 organizations in the global MSP community not capable of meeting basic managed services principles? Yeah. I think that that's completely accurate. And I'm probably being generous. It's probably much, much lower than that. So is it 5,000 to 10,000 people or organizations out there? Maybe it's larger. It's difficult to say. It's really difficult to say. But I think that you could take a look at what different government agencies talk about and are concerned about. You could take what the defense industrial base is certainly very worried about here in the United States, and all the work that they're doing with CMMC to try to get both MSP and MSP customers alike to be rising to a minimum level of cybersecurity preparedness and defensive posture. You could take what cyber insurance providers and underwriters have been saying to us for quite a long time, which is, there's a lot of those entities out there trying to insure a lot of those very risky companies who call themselves an MSP, who probably are not even close to being an MSP. Right. And it drags down the really solid work that the professional grade certified managed services community is doing, because they're out there trying to become very legitimate and trusted and dominant MSPs in the marketplace, doing really necessary, solid work. And they're being very transparent in everything that they do. They're facing in the open marketplace companies that this is not new. This is not a secret. This problem has existed for decades in our profession. And they're running up against these kind of wannabe MSPs who just haven't yet figured out that there's a lot more that they are responsible for. As there's a lot more responsibility they as MSPs have to abide by. So that's my assessment as of mid 2025, is that $500 billion of managed services spend globally is being produced by a large group of entities, probably 100,000 or more, and a small, very small subset of that group is actually dominating the growth of that market and are probably going to be taking up more and more market share. So of that 500 billion, that small 5 to 10,000 group of MSPs is going to, and this is my personal statement, my personal belief, they are going to be responsible for. They are, in fact, now responsible for a lot of that growth, that 11 to 14% annual growth that I mentioned earlier, I believe is coming from a very small subset of the managed services market. They are dominating. They're clearly growing. Or some of them have private equity backing. Many, many do not. Right. This is not just a PE equation, but these are qualified, transparent. Many of them are certified, and they are dominating in the markets, and they are grabbing more and more market share. The rest of the market is either going to wake up and realize that they have to change in order to become competent and competitive as a managed service provider, or they're going to be increasingly locked out of more and more regulated market opportunity. Things like CMMC, things like financial services, things like medical health services, things like legal services, accounting, shipping, transportation, energy, water, public works, on, right? Those types of activities are going to be increasingly turning their attention to more regulated, certified, transparent MSPs and giving their business to them. Does this change at all the market forecast for growth? No, not at all. But what it does change is the market is going to have to realize that either the non-certified, less mature providers are going to change their ways, or they're going to be an increasingly risky gamble in having in a channel program. And that is going to be that's going to be a big question. I am hopeful just seeing the number of MSPs that are coming in they're coming in off the street and saying, look, we are finally realizing that we have to be certified. We are finally realizing that we have to become capable of demonstrating and communicating our compliance and our best practices. Otherwise, we are going to lose business, right? That's a very, very common conversation that we have. And fine. I mean, we will help those MSPs all day long. And I think that that's going to become the major driver of most growth in managed services today. Not all, but a vast majority of that growth that we are all seeing is going to be increasingly comprised of a very small subset of MSPs who are competent, mature, highly transparent, and therefore most of them, if not all of them, certified at some level and able to drive growth, drive innovation, and protect their customers against a variety of threats that are consistently evolving and consistently bearing down on them. So let me summarize. The managed services community and the managed services profession is still really on solid financial ground. We are producing so much revenue relative to global IT services. And I believe at some point we're going to make up a dominant percentage of that $1.5 trillion that is being spent every year and rising. I think we need more MSPs. We need more and better MSPs. So if you are one of those that are out there and you don't feel like you are transparent enough, you maybe feel like you haven't been as transparent and internally secure as you could be, and maybe you just want some external eyes to look at what you're doing and make some incremental improvements. Let us know. Reach out to us. This is what we do. And if we can help you become more transparent and more trusted by your customers, then that's a win in my book any day. That's the size of the market. It's probably actually much smaller than most people realize, but it needs to grow. It needs to grow fast. And that's what we're going to be keeping a very close eye on over the next couple of years as we see more and more of those MSPs coming in. They've been operating alone by themselves with no oversight for so long. And it's kind of a weird thing for them sometimes to come in and recognize that there is such a demand for transparency and clarity into what they do. And it can sometimes be challenging for them. But once they go through it, they never look back. No one ever says, no, I want to go back to being what it was before. In fact, what they realize is, my gosh, I had no idea how much opportunity becoming certified, becoming more transparent, becoming more mature as an MSP. I had no idea how much business that would bring me. And that's probably the biggest takeaway that I've had in watching MSPs go from non-certified to becoming certified is the new doors it opens, the new opportunities, the new relationships that were never available to them before. They now realize, wow, it's like becoming almost a new company, new business, new customers, new areas of opportunity, new service options. Everything becomes new and available to them. So I hope this helped. If you have questions, certainly feel free to ping me in the comments or shoot us an email, and keep on going. There's a lot of business out there and we need more and more MSPs every day. So don't stop. That